Hi, everybody. Welcome once again to Beyond Now, our weekly Tuesday webinar here at Porto Business School. We're trying to understand what will happen beyond now. We're trying to understand what this uncertain and ambiguous future reserves to us. And as usual, we're lucky to have yet another great guest, a friend of our house, a visiting professor here at Porto Business School. Our guest today is Professor Charalampos Mainemelis, or Babis, as we all know him, and I'm sure that's how I will treat Babis. Babis is a professor of organizational behavior at Alba Graduate Business School in Athens, and the director of the SEV Center of Excellence in Creative Leadership. He has been a long-time visiting professor here at Porto Business School, teaching organizational behavior in our executive MBA. From 2001 to 2009, he was assistant professor at London Business School, where he still teaches occasionally. And his research focuses on creativity and its relations with leadership, learning, play, time, and defiance. He was also the co-editor of the Creative Leadership Contexts and Prospects, a book that was published by Routledge. Babis, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time. I hope everything is safe with you guys over there.
Hello, thank you very much. It has always been a great pleasure for me to physically be with you at Porto Business School. Now we have to do it digitally in the spirit of the time. But boa tarde to everyone. My pleasure to be able to connect with you digitally today.
Thank you, Babis. I'm pretty sure that we will have lots of your alumni around. To our audience, I remind you that you can, right from now, start putting your comments and questions in the comment box of YouTube. I will be following them and bringing them to the conversation. There's no Q&A parts. We will do this as a conversation, and I will embed your questions into the dialogue that I will be establishing with Babis. So let me just let's start here. Before COVID-19, organizations and their leaders were already in crisis. Billions and billions of euros and dollars were being spent on transformation efforts to better serve more informed and knowledgeable individuals, both in the workplace and in the marketplace. And at that moment, disruption was already in full swing. You could think of each transformation in each organization and in each leader as its own mini crisis. Now, with the global effects of the pandemic, imagine thousands of mini crises happening all at once, each in different phases and stages. People in nearly every organization are being asked to change the way they do things, to learn new concepts, to operationalize new standards, to accept and reach elevated levels of performance. Most of these standards transformation efforts meet similar challenges: resistance to embrace something new, frustration and exhaustion with implementation, a lack of agility to keep up, and not enough empathy along the way for those being asked to change. And for business leaders, the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated unprecedented change. The question most leaders are facing is this: how do we move forward in such uniquely uncertain circumstances? Creative leadership has been helping them to navigate this crisis. Creative leadership has become a cardinal force in the creation and evolution of adaptive organizations, ambidextrous organizations, as Babis always teaches us. And in this current day and age, Babis, how is creative leadership making a difference out there?
As you know, there are different expressions of creativity, many different expressions. One is creativity in times of crisis. It's creativity when we have to survive, when we have to adapt, when we have a tough problem. Creativity is one of the most adaptive mechanisms disposable to us to be able to tackle any type of situation or problem. So I think for many leaders, actually I would say for most leaders today, creative leadership means trying to do whatever needs to be done to your best of your ability, to think the unthinkable, to think of solutions you didn't think before in order to help your company survive in the midst of this crisis. And this, of course, can appear in different ways for different companies, for different organizations. But I think there is another expression of creativity and creative leadership that we will be seeing pretty soon, which is rethinking the organization. One way or the other, this crisis is going to change the way we think about markets, about products, about services, about work. It's not still clear, at least to me, how exactly it's going to be the day after, but I think there are many reasons to believe that it's going to be different in many ways. One of the most important things what we expect and companies expect from the leaders to do is to be able to rethink who are we, what is that we're offering, what are the needs of our customers, how have they changed. And this is a kind of a thinking process. And, I very much like the act of thinking. I think great leaders think in fresh ways, think in new ways, think in ways that perhaps they didn't think in the past. And I think this is a very timely period to be able to do something like that.
Yeah, we have been. There's this famous meme out there in the internet. What did the most for your digital transformation strategy? Was it the investment? Was it? And no, it was COVID-19. Suddenly, all companies had to fast track their digital transformation. But isn't there a danger of thinking that the digital transformation becomes the transformation, becomes the ambidexterity that we believe organizations should have, so they can focus on the digital because they are all remote, because they need to manage a flexible workforce that is working from home, and how to keep the teams operating, how to manage the projects and so on. And so the focus has been, let's get Zoom, let's get Teams, let's get all the infrastructure. But isn't there a danger of not translating that digital layer of transformation, of adjustment, into a cultural and also, in some sense, a leadership transition? Companies need to really be different and operate in different ways, or at least, if until a few months ago, 2 months ago, the operations side of the company was the fundamental part of the company. Mm-hmm. At this moment, when operations are frozen or downsized or whatever, we need to focus on what will be the exploration side, where we will position the company afterwards. Isn't there a danger of accelerating digital transformation becomes still very superficial, and it doesn't go to the deeper layers of organizational behavior and organizational change?
The danger to me would be to think that digital transformation is a solution in and of itself, and it's not. Digital economy, digital transformation, digital technology is a great means you can use to do different things. So as you know, we at education, we're all using Zoom to deliver learning and teaching, so that's a great solution, but you can never substitute the process of defining who you are, what is it that you're offering, and how you do it. You always need human minds to do that. So yes, clearly there's a danger to think it's going to solve all problems. I think what happens is that sometimes we take many things for granted, and in a crisis like this, you start realizing what is important and you cannot live without, and what is not as important and you can live without. And actually, many things that we thought were important, many routines, many more complicated processes, many organizations have managed to completely bypass them very quickly. And through using digital technology, which has been extremely useful, to be able somehow to cope with this thing and to remain functional and operational. But I have no doubt, I completely agree with you that you have to think, and companies have to think, and their leaders have to think. That being the case, what do we do with it? How can we use digital technology? What is the character of the company? What is it? How we're supposed to be using it? And that's part of where creativity, in terms of defining who you are, in terms of strategy, is going to be very important.
It's kind of up until two months ago, the creative organization. So the exploration side of the organization was in some sense a nice to have, and people were aware that they needed that it wasn't important to have it because disruption was out there. In 2 months, we had a transition from being a nice to have, from being a must have. Do you believe organizations that don't go this way will have a chance in surviving?
Look, you cannot have an ambidextrous organization. I mean, to me, there is something which I always find absolutely essential in any form of adaptive organization. And ambidextrous organizations are organizations that tend to be much more adaptive. Without the right mindset from people that lead at the top, it's impossible to be ambidextrous. You're not going to do it. So it has to be, it's really that fundamental part always starts at the top, and it's always nurtured at the top, and it's always supported by decisions at the top. If that fundamental part is there, I think that clearly you have the kind of adaptive structures in place, for example, having the more exploratory part of the organization. As you know, there are other organizations that may not have it in that form, but still are very agile because the mindset is agile. And being that open and receptive is absolutely important. I think this world will be very, very tough for leaders who simply are looking to go by and just preserve things or just copy and paste. You know, in a kind of a way, it's a kind of a world that you really have to think, what does it mean? Who are the customers? Who are the people that we're serving? What are the needs? How are these needs evolving? And how we're supposed to adapt? And these are questions that are absolutely wonderful if you are a creative leader, if you just like the challenge, if you like that it stimulates you, you can always try to find solutions. And I have to say, it could be very scary for all these people managing who are not used to do that. That probably would be a very bad time. I mean, in a kind of a way, you know, going through this COVID crisis, we all learned that perhaps in some ways we are more vulnerable than what we thought we were. In some ways, we learned that we are stronger and more adaptive than what we thought we were. But it's really a question of somehow actually readjusting. And of course, thinking what to do with all these opportunities that digital technology offers is one big part of the equation. But in the end of the day, we'll always be leaders of companies that will decide what is the right answer for their organization.
Mindset. I want to underline this and the importance of mindset, which becomes, of course, a fundamental aspect of organizational culture, and how the leaders can really need to be the key drivers of that mindset and that culture. One of the key features of ambidexterity is this ability of the organization to reallocate assets and capabilities to address new threats, new opportunities. Well, if this is a moment, this is the ultimate moment for that kind of capacity. I've been calling it some sort of organizational Darwinism. Adaptability becoming the key driving force of the organization. But in your opinion, you have covered mindset, but what are other common characteristics for successful ambidexterity to happen in organizations, despite the fact that we now need to accelerate it, but in a more overall aspect?
I can provide a list of characteristics, but to me, it all starts and ends with this one basic characteristic, which is really good, great leadership, especially when it comes to building adaptive organizations. There are some decisions that you cannot expect people in the lower levels to take. It's not because they cannot think of them, it's because the responsibility and the power to make these decisions come at the top. Ambidexterity, to be ambidextrous and to invest in the future is a decision that in the vast majority of cases, only the top people who have the power can take. If they don't make the decision, it's not going to happen. It's unlikely to happen. Then it is really important to decide what type of ambidextrous organization you're going to have. It's an important decision, right? It's an important decision to decide if you're going to do it through some kind of structural separation, where you actually physically, in terms of time, you separate different components of your company. It's a different question, try to do it what is called contextual ambidexterity, when you try to have more behaviorally flexible people in the company. Both can be very useful, both can be very powerful, but you must know which one fits better your own company. Right? To give you an example, if you're an automobile manufacturer, I would imagine chances are 9 out of 10 structural ambidexterity would be a better fit. If you are a consulting company or an advertising company, I would imagine that contextual ambidexterity might work much better, because you cannot say, I want to separate the people who speak to the customers from the rest of the organization, because that doesn't make sense. The people who talk to the customers are the people who have the ideas and who listen to the news and who get the feedback. And this is the stuff you're going to bring inside the company so that you can have new ideas for products and do new designs and so forth and so on. So it's really important how that is made. And then, there are also decisions in terms of how much you allocate, what is the right balance. As you know, it's never 50-50. It can be 60-40, 70-30, really depending. And it's something to be managed on the way. So this is something that has to be decided, understood, and monitored by people who lead. And if these people are not there, if they don't believe it, if they don't get it, it's unlikely to happen. And that's to me, it's the role of leadership in the long-term adaptability of corporations is extremely important. And of course, usually sometimes we talk about adaptability and ambidexterity in good times, because then times like this one come, and this is not the right moment to do it. I mean, you must have prepared your organization in advance. That's why we talk about these things in business schools. It's never too late, but
Bobby, sorry to interrupt you. Do you think that the companies that were already deeper into that movement, bringing a structural ambidexterity into the equation, were better equipped and to deal with this current circumstance? Are you seeing that happening?
We don't still have the empirical concrete data to be sure about it, but my feeling is based on what has happened in past similar situations. I would imagine that yes, probably they would be more likely, keeping other factors constant, to adapt to this one. We will be able to know it, once we have more data about it. But I would be surprised if that's not the case. Of course, it also has to do with other things like industry or sector. I mean, some sectors have been hit more than others based on this crisis. But again, if you just keep this constant and you look inside sectors, I think whatever you will find that the structure is more adaptable, or the mindsets are adaptable, or better, both, I think that would be higher than the average probability for these companies to survive, to reconfigure or even rethink themselves, and to be able to respond more creatively the day after.
And what about the other way around? Do you believe that the ones that were forced into agility and adaptability because of this current circumstance, that they had to change, they had to readjust circumstantially, contextual almost ambidexterity? Do you think that because of this will leverage a continuation of that ambidexterity in the organization in a post-crisis? So the other way around, the ones that had to become like ambidextrous because of the crisis, will that stick for them in the future?
Yeah, you see, sometimes what happens is a kind of a paradox, but you see me laughing because sometimes I see this happening a lot. Some companies are so badly structured, they are so poorly structured that they cannot possibly function that way. So in some cases, you may have sometimes the rise of the informal organization and people at different ranks. This happens especially in very large, very bureaucratic organizations. They have to find a way to get things done. So somehow you have more informal procedures and informal networks. So when a crisis like that happens, sometimes the whole organization says, guys, can you just please think of something? And it is that basic form of entitlement to people to be able to respond. It might happen as a kind of a crisis response at that level. But again, I don't think it's the best way to do it. I think it's much better to have an organization which has been designed to be more adaptable in the first place.
Absolutely.
And then again, and it's a big difference what type of organizations we're talking about, because right now we're generalizing, but it makes a big difference. So if you have a professional organizations, will be different, because professionals somehow, this is what happens to hospital, right? So you have the professional functions there that somehow have a different type of education and training to be able to respond professionally to that measure. But then again, you see how important would be leadership for thinking about hospitals as organizations, for example, now in the future, for how they're organized to cope with something like that.
Absolutely. It's quite interesting when we can I always use a slide. Well, my students know about this. I always use a slide that says uncertainty can be a guiding light. We hope it shouldn't have to be the guiding light. We should have been prepared for uncertainty before, but resilience also comes into mind. Understanding or turning the unadvantages, the problems, the challenges into perhaps opportunities, and at least having a positive attitude towards this. A lot of it has, from the leadership perspective, has to do with how well leaders can empathize with their teams and mobilize the teams. Sense of ownership, sense of belonging, sense of identification from the rest of the organization, because they believe in the leaders, because the leaders are really active on that. Do you believe that is an essential part? And how are you seeing this? Because right now we have to mobilize our teams. We have to help them, get them involved in the strategy. even though we're not face to face, we are from apart. From apart. How have you been thinking about this?
I think it's very important. I think if leaders cannot unite people, they cannot excite people, it's very difficult to happen. But at least in the type of stuff that I'm looking, I've been looking for creativity and innovation companies for ages now. It's a really interesting question to ask is what makes people trust their leaders? What makes people get inspired by leaders? What makes people believe in leaders? And there are lots of different things, but their intellectual ability, their intellectual competence usually tends to be very, very important. So you know that your leader understands what's going on. And in a situation like this, where sometimes people start to asking, what the hell is going on? What's happening? A leader must also be capable to be able to provide that type of cognitive, I wouldn't say certainty, but at least some form of stability. Someone who can really people know that the way he or she as a leader or as a team of leaders look at the world, they really trust that. And then other things can really follow from that. So the emotional part, the part of empathy, the part of supportiveness, the part of making people feel safe is very, very important. But in situations like this, trusting that our leaders have some type of mental control of the world, not other forms of control, but in terms of mental control, if you understand what's going on, I think this is one of the most reassuring people leaders can provide to their teams. Because then the team says, okay, this guy knows what's going on. So basically, we can trust. And other things can follow after that and build on that.
Still on the topic of the connection, the relationship, the engagement between leaders and the teams, there's a question here from Savannah Pierce. Will it be harder for leaders to influence the development of soft skills within their teams that are digital teams at this moment?
Well, it has to do with two things. It has to do with the type of work, and it has to do with the type of interdependence. Clearly, for leaders, that their way of working would be to get a team of 6 people, but was not clear what each one of these people do. That would be a different ball game. But for people who are used to working in teams that are highly professionalized and very different roles, the challenge might still be there, but my feeling is that it will be somehow easier because the role allocation, the role specification is much is already there. So to give you an example, if you're a film director making a film, part of the magic happens when everybody comes together, and people, they will do their own stuff and you can change things and you get inspiration, no doubt. Still, if not, part of this has to happen up to the point that it is possible, happen separately. People still individually have a good sense of what is it that they have to do. So in that sense, my feeling is this type of context, of whole context, leaders might find it on balance a bit easier to make the transition. Whereas if I compare it with leaders of teams that were very undifferentiated, and you have just like 6 people coming in, not knowing in advance what they're going to do, probably that is gonna be more difficult to make the transition. And I think this is where leaders must be more willing and eager to experiment with new ways to be able to communicate and unite people. But again, if you ask me, so what's going to make a difference? I mean, one of the things that's going to make a difference is the ability to communicate well. Right? And the ability to communicate, leaders who know how to communicate well, my feeling is that they have a higher chance of being able to develop their skills so they can communicate better digitally.
And trust, there was a question just popping up that I want to really bring it because it is the same regarding confidence and trust between the members of the organization and the organization, right? How to create more confident teams remotely from the leadership perspective? And it's about communication in some sense, right, Pablo?
It is communication. So for all people who listen to us, look, usually when you're in a time of crisis, and people know that the situation is very bad and you're trying to manage your team in these ways, most people are reasonable and know that it is a kind of a special situation. So my feeling is all other things be equal, they would be more likely to give you a chance because they know you're just managing something very urgent. And that might be a good opportunity for you to make some kind of control experiments. What's more likely to work and to see what works best in terms of communication, what might not work. I think it's a good time. It's a good period, the first period of adjustment, to do this kind of mini experiments, try out new things to see what's working best for the team, and also to be ready to know that perhaps it would be a different type of a team. And some of the part of the solution might be designing some other stuff, not only communication. How the work gets done, the degree of interdependency, and things of that nature that evidently have a lot to do with the very specific content of the work. But look, here's the thing again: companies that manage to have this kind of what I call a very mature culture of mutual trust, where you'd say to people, "I don't have to monitor you every single minute. I trust you're a very serious professional. I trust you will do your work, even if I'm not there." These companies are already much better adapted to work through digital environment. Companies or leaders that used to always be kind of, very micromanaging people want to be there. My feeling is that it would be much more difficult for them, but for a sort of variety of ways, especially in high professionalized context, it was not very useful anyways. So it might be a good time to make the transition.
Yeah, this might be a big, because one of the things, and our colleague and friend Mark Fritz a couple of weeks ago here on the webinar was also mentioning that there was in this last 2 months we have seen immense evolution on the way leaders and team leaders have been managing their teams. Because in one moment when we had to send everybody home and doing remote work and working from home and home office, there's this tendency of micromanagement and micro control. Send me the report, send me a daily log of everything you've done, and slowly, or well, it's not slowly, but it was already 2 months. It's 2 months, but it started evolving, and people started getting adjusted and used to that. And there was some. Mark was mentioning that an adjustment from a micromanagement culture to a more trust-oriented culture, which is empowering execution. It's a little bit on what General McChrystal writes about on the Team of Teams, empowered execution, shared consciousness. Perhaps those ideas, those values of shared consciousness, the things that bind us together as an organization and members of this organization, that simultaneously this idea of empowered execution that McChrystal wrote on a Team of Teams have been to some extent also accelerated during this moment, and might become, so they might help these organizations that had they didn't have a trust culture, they had a more micromanaging culture, to transition to that trust culture because they had to do it. There was no other way, and actually perhaps it worked well, right?
Yes, and I always say the most adaptive part of an organization, the most adaptively flexible, is always the individual. Individuals can be much more flexible than large and sometimes difficult to move around organizations. And perhaps it's a good opportunity for leaders to discover that, how adaptable people can be if somehow you relax some of the more bureaucratic type of procedures that you have in place. But I would also say in terms of identification, I think it's really important. I agree, it's very important for leaders to know that people identify with, but then the important is to fill out the sentence. They identify with what? Many organizations I studied, people do not necessarily identify with the company, but they can identify very strongly with their profession. They can identify very strongly with their work. They identify very strongly with their colleagues, not necessarily with the organization. And that can be okay as long as the job gets done and the outcome is good. So once again, trying to find a new balance of identification. There are other options besides identifying with your company, and I've studied for ages the creative economy. In the creative economy, sometimes you have temporary organizations, temporary projects. So people do not really identify that much with a studio in Hollywood or the record label. They identify, however, a lot with the other people doing the work. They identify with the profession, they identify with the work. So there may be also alternative ways to strengthen identification besides simply having people identify with the organization. And you know what? That's another thing, that organizations that used to be more temporary and more virtual and more project based, my gut feeling is that they may find it they may find it easier to make the transition. They may be somehow more prepared than organizations where physical presence and 8-hour shifts this might be a bit more challenging at first time to do.
This is a very interesting topic. Before I jump into the next question, I just want to make a small comment, because a few years ago, well, many years ago, I read this book called The Starfish and the Spider, about starfish organizations and spider organizations, and that led me into my PhD research. And I was researching Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda as the archetype of what I called in my PhD the new emergent organization, an organization that doesn't have any of the elements of a traditional organization as recognized so by organizational theories, but still had very high levels of identification, of sense of shared belonging, of purpose. And by the way, they were very, very effective. Nobody knew their offices. Actually, they didn't even know anything else about the organization aside that it was very effective. And I think there's an interesting parallel. This was many years ago, but there's an interesting parallel here when organizations needed to become more starfish than spider. They had to spread their brain throughout the cells of the organization and trust that those cells will perform those jobs. So the jobs, and I have here some questions about the assigned goals and all of that, but this was just a comment, not so much a question, because it is also in the field of my research. Babis, we have a great question. Yeah, go ahead.
So the problem why many organizations cannot be like Al-Qaeda, thank God.
Thank God.
is because the things that you do cannot be reduced to a very small set of values that everybody ascribes, and it's a very close. I mean, especially in a highly creative organization, sometimes people identify with disagreeing and have disagreements and creative tension. So that's why so many organizations, I guess, cannot be. But having that small core set of what is it that makes us an organization, I agree that would be very important for any type of organization.
I'm curious to understand in 10 years or so how the theories of organizations will have evolved after this current day and age. So in 10 years, when we start analyzing the data, what was the impact on organizational theory? That would be cool. We have here
may I just say? May I just say something? Because I'm, like the rest of us, I've been following the crisis, and I'm seeing how the news anywhere in the world look at this pandemic and the way the health system in each country tries to. It's a really interesting thing because part of it is the virology part of it is the medical treatment part. But at the end of the day, whether a hospital can respond or not, it's an organizational issue. If you find a vaccine, it's not an organizational issue. If you have a treatment, it's a medical issue. But if you have enough ITU units, kind of intensive care beds or not, and how you should organize to have them when you need them, it's an organizational problem. It's a very difficult organizational problem. It's very difficult to organize a huge organization or a huge system of organizations like hospitals for the next pandemic that may happen in 10 years. Might be very expensive for you to get ready for that, while in the meantime, you may not be using that capacity. It's a very difficult problem. And it's a kind of a problem that if the scale and the magnitude of challenges of that kind continues to happen, whether it is through viruses, whether fires, all of these different things, that would be a really challenge for organizational theory to answer. How do we build organizations that are possible based on the means that we have? Because another interesting observation for me is that the wealthiest nations did not necessarily respond better. The health systems did not necessarily respond better. It's not just a question of economics. It's really an organizational question. And I think that's be a very difficult, challenging set of questions for us to answer. How do you build organizations that we want them to be there when something really bad happens, whether it is a virus, epidemic, whether it is virus or anything like that, and you just prepare them for a very unlikely event but somehow it's going to happen. So organizational theory has a lot of things to answer about that.
Fascinating discussion. We have a great question from Gustavo Mendes, our colleague, professor at Porto Business School. Creativity implies divergent thinking. In periods of crisis, it is particularly difficult to diverge. Do you have any suggestions on ways to influence the divergence in leadership?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, in my experience, it has three dimensions. The first one is usually in periods of crisis, people do not become more creative; they tend to become less. Usually crisis is not good for divergence thinking. Crisis tends to
Exactly. You want to
somehow
have checklist,
so
checklist thinking, and yeah.
It's the whole idea of threat rigidity effect. So basically, it tends to make us feeling threat in the environment tends to make us more rigid and to narrow our responses. That too. However, if we don't have any response, if we just look what we have available right now, and no response is available, we are forced to look for another solution. And this is where somehow we can liberate new ways of thinking. My experience is that in some organizations, people have ideas and they don't talk about these ideas because they know they're going to be rejected. So they just wait. And when a crisis happens, they just offer their idea as a solution because somehow they know, it's needed. And everybody's talking about how fast digital change is happening in companies. You know what? You know that. Not everything in the digital was invented yesterday. Some of these things were already available. And some people in companies and their minds, they already are in the desks. They have the plans of how to make this change. So they found the opportunity and they're using it, which is good. But my feeling is sometimes in crisis, if there is a need and there is a problem and we have a solution, people want that. So in that case, although the basic principle is that a crisis time is not good for divergent thinking, at the same time, it's a good time to provide good solutions to problems, and in that respect, it can be. So, anyways, going back to the question, what I would say is that to me, it's really important for leaders themselves to radiate stability and optimism. So, one thing great leaders can do to make people in their teams to remain open-minded and to think divergence is to be able to involve in the conversation, to communicate well, to make sure that they know that the situation, at least mentally, it is under control. And this great quality, which is called inspiration and vision for the future, these are the elements that if our leaders do these things, we tend to feel relatively safer. And when we feel relatively safer, we experience higher degrees of hope and higher degrees of optimism, which tends to trigger higher degrees of divergence. I do think, yeah, it's a great question. I think it's one thing leaders can do by being more stable and more optimistic and radiating confidence and trust that actually make people to experience lower levels of threat and higher levels of hope and optimism and perseverance for the future.
It's wonderful. Let me go to a topic that I know you hold dear, assigned goals. So there's a considerable agreement in the literature that creative leaders must find an optimal balance between autonomy and structure. And it has been suggested that goal setting allows leaders to influence employees' motivation, effort, attention in the creative process. There's even a study that you know quite well. You have been showing to our students also at IDEO that found that presenting a challenging goal, a difficult goal at the beginning of a brainstorming session stimulated creativity. So I think I kind of know the answer to this question, but do the difficult goals, and we are living in an age of the most difficult goals. Do you think that those difficult goals increase performance by creativity?
Well, in general, yes, but there are many buts. Now, let me say this. Creativity thrives on challenge, all forms of creativity. And any form of creativity, human creativity in history, loves challenging things, difficult things. And of course, goal setting can be one means to nurture that process. So yes, difficult goals, challenging goals tend to be very good to liberate people's creativity and creative performance. However, it is important that the challenge, it is challenging, but it is doable, because otherwise people may experience cynicism that they cannot do it. What I would say is that it's really important to know. So for leaders, absolutely, they can use difficult goals, they can use challenging goals, and they have to be framed difficult but important, so people actually can approach them in a positive mindset. At the same time, you have to know that the people to whom you assign the goals have the required skills to tackle them. Because if they don't, they start feeling scared. So it's most important to know that people have the skill set to tackle these difficult challenges, and you give them the incentive. And I would say in most forms of creativity and innovation, they help. If I can describe an exception, perhaps it's not as timely to what we're experiencing today. In teams what you really want your team to do is to have very high magnitude of radical breakthrough creativity to completely invent the future. In those cases, if you as a manager, you provide the goals, in a kind of way you start narrowing what they can do. So in this type of settings, perhaps all you can do is say to people, I know you love what you do. I know you're just crazy about your work. Just choose on your own your goals and work on whatever you think is exciting. And I think that would fit a bit better, a kind of small team or department where you really try to focus on their attention, not on incremental forms of creativity, but on very highly radical. In most other cases, I would say that goals, if framed well, difficult goals, challenging goals, as long as you have qualified people who love doing it, tends to really stimulate the competitive spirit and the playfulness in a good sense. Yes.
We have a very cool question. I think, I don't know, I know it might not fit the exact scope of your research, but you might have interesting data, or if not, you have your opinion, of course. It's a question from Pilar Moraes. Knowing Portuguese culture and our way of doing things, can you pinpoint some advantages and disadvantages of our temperament, of our cultural assets during this time of crisis, and how, for instance, does it compare to the Greek experience, for instance? So our culture, individual, societal, our temperament, our southern way of being, does it have an influence in how we react in circumstances, in challenging circumstances, and of course, in how creative we can be?
That's a great question. I think I find Portuguese to be, in terms of emotionality, I find Portuguese to be a bit more balanced than the Greeks. The Greeks can be a little bit more Mediterranean, if you will, sometimes the emotional reactions. But I think if one thing is similar is that there are cultures that have some kind of working together, being more collaborative. I think I've experienced that in Portugal. So I think for Portuguese to come together in a room and be asked to do something, to tackle it, is something that, in terms of the culture, comes as easy thing to do. And I think this is something that is really needed to do in times like that. And if the economy goes more into the direction of not having, something like huge structure, but having somehow smaller teams. By the way, we already know that many large, huge organizations, even before the crisis, they've been really running experiments on how they would transform themselves to a collection of smaller units, right? Just to be able to be more agile. It's one of the very interesting experiments with organizational structure that have been taking place three, four last year before COVID. Why? Because they really want to be big, to have the power of being big, but at the same time, to gain the benefits of having this kind of small agile teams. And my feeling is, my experience of most places in Southern Europe that I'm familiar with, that is something that tends to fit well the culture of these places. That you can somehow have smaller units or teams that can come together, they collaborate, you give them a goal, you give them a question, and somehow they try to figure it out. I think that's something that certainly is very, very useful. And perhaps this is something that the Portuguese economy or the Greek economy can actually use more than, they can use more of it in the future.
Thank you so much. It is, by the way, I would like to tell our audience that next week, not this week, not this Thursday, the following Thursday, so if I get it right, on the 14th of May, the guest of our Dean Ramona Callaghan for the Dean's Lounge is an expert in intercultural relations, and he will cover those topics of how different cultures have influenced different reactions of leaders out there to this circumstance, and I think it's a very, very interesting topic that connects a little bit with what we were mentioning. We're running towards the end of our show. I wanna move a little bit, not move, but I'd like to understand your view on your topic, in your opinions on how the leadership is also perceived by customers. So the importance, so thinking outbound, thinking out there, we have all been saying to our partners, to our students, that after guaranteeing the full protection of your co-workers, you need to guarantee the full protection of your customers, and you really need to be there for them. You really need to be there not to sell, but to deliver value, to be side by side with them. What is the importance? How do you think customers perceive the leadership, its creativity, and its efficiency? And how important is that on maintaining or even expanding, scaling a business relation?
Well, let me say this. Many surveys and studies we've been seeing the last 10, 15 years would show just a decline in the level of trust that the public in general, including but not limited to consumers, has about leaders of really big, large organizations. That's something that's already, there's a kind of a declining level of trust, how much you trust it, right? And there are many reasons for that. And in a crisis like that, it's always the decisions leaders make can really strengthen or really weaken that level of trust. I'm not a prophet. I cannot possibly know what would be the aftermath of this, but I would not be surprised if, among other things, it really changes the way we evaluate what leadership does and what leadership is in terms of taking care of the interest of people, whether they are the employees or organizational members or the customers in the long run. Because part of these problems and the whole idea of ambidexterity, as you know, was just to say it's good to do well in the present, but you must also take care of the future. I mean, that's a very simple thing. You must also tend to what would be good for the future. And I really think we need leaders that clearly, and I hope they will be evaluated for that, who tend about not what is good in a very narrow sense for today, but what also will be good for them, for the companies, for the people working in the company, for the customer in the long run. And the more their certainty rises, my feeling is that this is going to be something that I think and I hope that people will be asking more for leaders. And sometimes having this kind of external pressure is good because it helps you somehow also activate some of your best values. But if I can just say so, one thing that we saw happening before, and my feeling is we'll be moving more, leadership, instead of having one leader, we'll be moving toward more collaborative leadership models in many companies. So instead of having just one person decide, we have more collaborative leadership. You still have leaders. I cannot imagine organizations not having leaders, but it's becoming more collaborative in some forms, in some places. It is becoming more integrative. So you get lots of experts, lots of good minds. Someone has to run the show, but everybody has a chance to contribute. And part of what great leaders do is to be able to elicit good ideas and then find a way to integrate them. And I think this is something that my feeling is probably will be seeing much more in the future, perhaps because of the COVID and because of all this kind of digital transformation thing. My feeling is that a great part of the economy will go down that way. And of course, to be able to function in more collaborative context, people have to trust that you're doing what is good also for them. So I think that's another driver of making leadership more collaborative and perhaps more open-minded in terms of the common good.
I agree with you. It's a fascinating movement that we're seeing. And actually, an interesting topic is also how collective leaderships are rising also from organic movements and voluntary community movements. I've been analyzing in every single day how community movements have been emerging. Organic movements, citizen-driven movements have been emerging as almost organizations. There's a wonderful phenomenon here, Babis. I think we need to research this together. There's a group of founders here in Porto, founders of startups, well-established startups and scale-ups, that had this idea to respond right in the beginning of the pandemic, to respond in some way to the critical challenges, and mainly they were health and how to support the national health system. And these founders came up with a small group with a small idea. They created this movement called Tech for COVID-19. And it's interesting. We ran a podcast with one of the founders of that movement, which is an alumnum from Porto Business School, and he had this thought. We went from idea to small startup to a big organization of 4,500 volunteers in 2 weeks. We had to go from idea to big corporation in 2 weeks, with all the layers of organization that they had to put, and with a collective leadership, which is in some sense, or I wouldn't say crowdsourced leadership, but some sort of collective collaborative leadership, which is very interesting phenomenon that we are seeing a little bit around Europe.
And I think, if I say this, because I've been fascinated by that. I mean, one of the studies I've done the last 4 years is the opera. And the world of opera has been absolutely fascinating to me because it's very, very, very complex, an opera production. It's very expensive. And it is done by people who many of them do not even know each other. And all they come together is like 3 weeks. It's like literally they can live anywhere in the world. And they come from all different places of the world 3 weeks to put it together. And most of the work up to that point is modular. And it works. Why does it work? Because people have some kind of understanding what is it they have to do when they're working on their own, when they're working in the module, when the modules come together during the rehearsals. So certainly something that can be learned. Even something so complex and so complicated, it's a live performance. You cannot fail. But I mean, there are some types of organizations out there that have been doing that, and they've been doing with great success, even without having permanent employment. So certainly, there are so many good examples that leaders can look at to really be able to cultivate this kind of leadership capability of having people taking the responsibility, doing the work, and then somehow you bring it together at some point in time.
Let me get a last question from our audience, because then I want to reserve the last one for a question that I have here in the back of my pocket, which is slightly different, but I'll go there. Andrea Nunes, in your opinion, which are the dangers or challenges unforeseen yet for companies and their leaders with the mass globalization of digital?
Oh, that's a great question. And I don't think I can do a good job answering it. I'll tell you what I think. It seems to me it is really reshuffling. It's completely reshuffling the power balances in so many fields. So you see what's happening now. It's like Netflix is doing well. I mean, whatever it does can do. But you have some of the individual artists in so many creative industries suffering. So it's a really good question. I don't think I can do a good job answering it in the course of a short conversation. But digital has this kind of this quality of being, on the one hand, can make everything much more democratic, and you can find much easier access to be able to do your work and distribute your work. On the other hand, it can really lead to some new form of high concentration of power and controlling access. And it seems to me there are these two dynamics that are getting played out. And my feeling is that's what I'm seeing happening now with the COVID. So you have many people in the creative industries that freelance people, they cannot do any type of work. It's a big problem, creative and cultural industries. At the same time, you do have sales of tunes and movies and stuff going on through Netflix or through Tuben. So that's what I mean. There's a kind of reshuffling of power, and I'm not sure if it has been settled yet. I think there's a great deal of disruption still happening and going on. I wish I could answer this question, but I don't think I have all the information to be able to do a better job answering.
If you allow me, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sure some type of reshuffling, big reshuffling of power is going to happen, and it's happening, but I don't know how it's going to end.
If you allow me to also throw my 2 cents, I would look for, and I would pay attention to speed. The speed for decision, the time to decide, the time to act. This is getting crazy, and digital will enhance that. Working with quarterly forecasts might be just stupid. The speed of things is the one thing that I am paying close attention to in terms of big dangers / challenges and the magnitude of its impact in the way we work, the way we decide, the way we lead organizations. I think it's something we need to pay attention. Babis, we are 5 minutes away from the end, and our own good dear friend, Daniel Bessa, Professor Daniel Bessa, was one of the first guests in our Dean's Lounge webinar, together with our associate dean, Patricia Charalampos. And at that moment, and this was already, it was already a month and something ago. This really goes fast. And he was mentioning that political leaders are in denial. Do we need more creative leadership in our political leaders in Europe and our countries?
Yes, we do. We do. That's a great question. Let me say this. I believe, and I have to say this because I've taught, there are many different ways to teach leadership. I've always been a fan, very consistent throughout my academic career, teaching class in terms of leadership skills. I believe in skills. And I really think what this crisis shows, I don't want to mention names, but if you just look how different political leaders have handled this, you know how important it is for people to have skills. Any sort of skills that they can be to lead are important. And my feeling is those people who really had the skills in place, and by the way, have also had good teams. So they had a really great team, skillful team around them. It seems to me that they are the political leaders that have done a much better job into handling this crisis. Now, in terms of creativity, for me, for political leaders, there is some things that there is a form of creative leadership where actually you create today all those sort of conditions that will allow other people to be creative in the future. This is something that great sociologist Philip Selznick wrote a long time ago. He's the sociologist who actually coined the term creative leadership in 1957, a long time ago. And it was very close to his idea. Sometimes you do something as a leader, but perhaps at that moment people do not recognize it as creative in the way you say a creative movie, a creative song. However, you really create the whole foundation upon which other people, perhaps the other generations, will be able to create new things. And in that sense, I have no doubts, not only that political leaders can do that, but we actually need political leaders to do that. And we live in a time that we have so many new challenges. We have really very challenges of the magnitude of them is huge, is global, but we have to sometimes to respond to them in a local level. And I'm fairly sure that there is so much more creativity that can be played there. Let me give you an example. I feel that European leaders could do so much more to have part of the response to what's happening at the European level. I don't think we'll be using, as a European Union, all the capacity of responding better together. Some response has to be local, has to be national, of course. Still, it seems to me that there is so much more to explore and exploit of how you can pull together resources and use better your network and the capacity of your network to have a better response. That, for example, would be a more creative type of solution. But yes, absolutely. I believe in. I know political leaders have not had a good last 25 years around the world, but I have no doubt they can be creative. Some of them are, and clearly we need it more, and we really need it. We need this kind of political foundation of decisions to be able to do more things as companies or as individuals.
Babis, thank you so much for your time and for your kindness, for sharing your ideas with us. You are a good friend of our institution, of our school, and I hope that we see you again physically, presentially, as soon as possible. And I wish you all the best, that you stay safe, you, your family, and your loved ones. Thank you.
Yeah, obrigado. It has been the best part of my year for the last 16 years to visit Porto twice a year, and I certainly digital is fine, really, but the physical is better. So I really hope I'll be able to be back soon. Okay, obrigado. Thank you to all.
Babis, thank you so much. I also thank our audience for staying connected. Don't forget that next Thursday, if you're seeing this live, next Thursday, we're having the Dean's Lounge, and the guest of our associate dean, Patricia Charalampos, will be no other than the rector of the University of Porto, and he will be talking about the science of the pandemic. So stay tuned. It's next Thursday at 6 Porto time on our YouTube. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Obrigado.